We have the pleasure of having a talk today by one of our fellows, Professor Rita Banerjee, on a very interesting subject, Rabindranath Tagore and the Nation. We know about the many debates that were initiated by Rabindranath Tagore in the 1920s and 30s about nationalism, about the meaning of the Indian nation, about Swadeshi, about Swaraj, etc., etc. And he had important discussions with many of the other leaders many of the leaders of the freedom struggle, most importantly with Gandhi, and a lot has been written on this subject. So Tagore's idea of the nation is important in the international context also. As we very well know, he presented a very meaningful critique of nation and nationalism, and he started a discourse on internationalism. So, considering all these things, this topic becomes very, very important. So, I welcome, though Dr. Rita Banerjee, of course, is our fellow. She belongs to this institution, but still on this occasion, I welcome her. And along with this, I welcome Professor Nandita Basu, who is from Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies at Delhi University. She taught there for 38 years, and her area of specialization is the growth of Bengali literary scholarship as an academic discipline, medieval Bengali narrative poetry, and women's literature. And she has written and translated many important works. So we have invited her to chair this lecture of Dr. Rita Banerjee. So I warmly welcome her, and I welcome all members of the audience also. So for further conducting the program, now I hand it over to Professor Nandita Basu. We normally have give the speakers 40-45 minutes, followed by about 20-30 minutes of discussion. So I'm there anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Misra. It is indeed a pleasure to be here in Nehru Memorial Museum Library, and more so because Dr. Rita Banerjee was also in Delhi University. I used to meet her in Central Library very often, though I don't know her very closely, but I have always found that she is very much interested in scholarship. So madam, I'll request you to present your paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I would like to state at the outset that this is essentially work in progress. It's based on work done on my project, India, the East and the West, and Rabindranath Tagore's Vision, undertaken at the Nehru Memorial Museum. I would like to thank the NMML and especially our respected director, Mr. Shakti Sinha, for the opportunity given me to work on the project. I hope I am able to do justice to the support given me. Since I still have more than a year to go before completing the project, I would be very grateful for any queries, comments, and suggestions from today's audience, which would enable me to revise or modify my work and benefit from them. Since a great deal of the material I draw on is written in Bengali, I would refer to available translations which I can find and shall use my own wherever necessary. I would also try to relate Tagore's non-fictional essays with his narratives and poems as much as possible. I would like to thank, of course, the audience for coming here. Tagore obviously was a very controversial figure, and his stance or his attitude or his view on the nation and nationalism had been debated and controverted in many ways. So I would go on to this. It is, since the nation has been viewed from various perspectives during in a subject country like India towards the end of the 19th century, the concept of nation and nationalism were essentially associated with the freedom movement going on at the time. In Tagore's case, as we'll see, the concepts of nation and nationalism get associated with his views of the East and the West. Finding it difficult to find the equivalent of the word nation in Bengali, Tagore says that in Indian languages, the word jati is often used to refer to nation. Though the word jati has connotations of caste as well as race, and the word jatiyo as a counterpart of national might refer to Bengalis as jati, Marathis as a jati, or Sikhs as a jati, without necessarily referring to all Indians as a jati. Since there is no exact equivalent of the word nation in Indian languages, clearly implying that the concept was not present in India, it was perfectly fair to use the English word to denote a Western concept. And in his essay on what is a nation, Tagore uses the word nation without translating. This essay was written around 1902 or 3, 1308 Bengali Sal. Tagore refers extensively to the idea of the nation propounded by the French thinker and philosopher Ernest Renan. There was no nation in olden times, and the Roman Empire came as close as possible to nationhood, although Rome had not been able to form a nation. People at various times found different reasons for the constitution of nationhood: a centralized authority like the monarch, uniformity of race, language and religion, commercial interests and geographical boundaries, etc. However, in Renan's view, none of these causes contributes solely to the making of a nation. It is shared historical memory and a conscious desire to unite and live together in order to preserve the ideals of the past and the vision of the future that contribute to national consciousness. The nation Renan views as a living ideal based on mental or emotional unity, an imaginary community in the way Benedict Anderson had later conceptualized it. Seeking to apply Renan's ideas to India, Tagore argues in Bharatbhorshio Samaj that this act of unifying is the greatest contributor to the growth of civilization. In Europe, national unity is the greatest means of combining people, while in India, the sense of national unity is lacking. The greatness of Hindu civilization had, over the years, assimilated and merged people of different races, castes, cultures, religions, and languages into a cohesive unity. In Tagore's view, in India and perhaps in the East, it is society which is more important than the concept of the nation. But Tagore conceives of the society not as an amalgamation of dying customs and rituals, but a changing living institution, inspiring people to develop themselves and contribute to the general weal. The individual's duty is to contribute to various spheres of society: education, health, food, and wealth. Rejecting the central role of self-interest in society, Hindutva, or the Hindu ideal, inspires one to view the image of human society as in Brahma, and to unite the whole body of society in the selfless goal of general good. Giving precedence to society over nation, Tagore declares, if the Indian society becomes active and living and revitalized, quote, our lack of freedom and other misfortunes will become insignificant. The active independence of our society is greater than other independences, unquote. It is significant that he calls this collection of essays in which Bharatbhorshio Samaj occurs, which discuss the nation, Indian society and Swadeshi Samaj or Swadeshi society, Atma Shukti or own strength. The thrust of his argument in many of these essays is to develop our Indian selves by constructive work and inner strength, as opposed to seeking help from the British as rulers and writing petitions to them. The Swadeshi Samaj, written around 1904 or 5, that's 1311 BS, is based on the response of the government towards the problem of water scarcity in Bengal. In keeping with this ideal of self-reliance and village upliftment, Tagore suggests that Indians could achieve this by each contributing their bit towards alleviating the problem and by acquiring some money by organizing Swadeshi melas all over Bengal, rather than depending on the government to extend aid. Tagore's attitude reflects one of the various stances towards the country and British rule during this period. According to Prithvi Chandra Ray, the editors of the Indian World, there were broadly two kinds of views about the British government during this period. The first view, held by the group of people characterized as moderates, shared an attachment to the British connection and considered colonial self-government to be the ultimate goal. On the other hand, there were the extremists who were subdivided into three categories. Of the three, the first was demarcated as the Tagore group, who advocated self-help and indigenous self-development, ignoring British rule. They differed from the other two categories who advocated overthrow of British rule as incompatible with national progress, one suggesting a protracted period of separation for the move, the other supporting immediate action. Tagore is differentiated on the one hand from the petitioning group of moderates who rely on the procurement of British aid by demanding succor from the government which taxed Indians, and on the other from the extremists who believe in a political revolution. Shumit Jorka sees a fourfold classification. 1. The moderates, the advocates of constructive Swadeshi, to which Tagore belongs. 3. The extremists who supported passive resistance in addition to self-development. And 4. Terrorists. Tagore's promotion of constructive Swadeshi might have originated in the 1880s, as Sarkar points out, but it certainly is pervasive in his writings and his work. One notices constructive Swadeshi in action in his venture of the Swadeshi Bhandar in 1897, and certain concrete suggestions in Swadeshi Samaj. But even in Ghorebari, 1915, Bimola speaks of Nikhilesh's various ventures of Swadeshi banking, of extracting date juice, and of soap making. Although these were rather comical versions of constructive Swadeshi, they might give us an idea of the way it flourished during the early years of the 20th century. Indian enterprises like textile mills, handloom, match and soap factories, earthenware, etc. proliferated during the period. Apart from launching Swadeshi enterprises, Tagore also suggested the formation of village panchayats by indigenous efforts rather than letting the government form them. During the Swadeshi movement, he had launched a benevolent society in one of his estates, involving 60,000 to 70,000 people and 125 villages. Elected officials from the villages administered the money which accumulated in the society. The estate contributed part of the money, and part of it came from the taxes consented to and levied by the members themselves. The money was utilized in village welfare projects like digging ponds, building roads, schools and dispensaries, etc. This was a kind of mini panchayat, and Tagore was able to demonstrate that his village autonomy program had clarity and viability, unlike Nikhil's in Ghorebari. According to his son, Rabindranath, Tagore had even launched an agricultural bank to help debtors who were greatly exploited by moneylenders. Despite initial teething troubles, the bank survived, and later Tagore donated his Nobel Prize money to the Shantiniketan school with the suggestion that the money be invested in the bank. This led to profitability and success. However, despite a stand on autonomous development, Tagore came close to the passive resistance group during the early years of the 20th century. His closeness and respect for Aurobindo Ghosh, who might be said to belong to the passive resistance group, which focused on picketing and boycott of British goods, government services, etc., but secretly cherished plans of armed uprisings, is important. Not only was Aurobindo Ghosh arrested in the sedition case related to Bonde Mataram, the nationalist newspaper of which he was the editor, but he was later in 1908 implicated and arrested in the Alipur bomb case involving many members of the Anushilan Shumiti. Tagore praised the newspaper and wrote an open verse letter eulogizing Ghosh in 1907 when he was first arrested on charges of sedition, where he paid obeisance to Ghosh as the friend of the country, Desh Bandhu, and voice incarnate of the country's soul. Aurobindo Robindre Loho Namaskar. That's how the poem begins. For such a one, there was no honor, no wealth, no happiness. The patriots spurned these enticements. Tagore declares that no king could punish the messenger who came with God's lamp to the earth. It is significant that although some critics have argued that Tagore moves away from the support of such Swadeshi activities later for good, I would try to show that he continued to cherish his respect for such revolutionaries despite disagreement of views with them. And I'll come back to this point later. In 1905, after Lord Curzon announced the government's intention to partition Bengal into two states, Bengal evinced an outburst of patriotism. Tagore composed such well-known patriotic songs as Banglar Mati Bangla Jol, Amar Shonar Bangla Ami Tomay Bhalobashi, which is the national anthem of Bangladesh, and O Amar Desher Mati Tomar Pore Thakai Matha. And also defined songs which threw a challenge to the government for presuming to divide the people and their motherland. You think you are strong enough to break the bonds of destiny, quote unquote, Bidhir bandhon katbe tumi emni shoktiman. And jodi tor dak shune keu na ashe, if no one answers your call, walk alone. Jurashaku Thakurbari members walked through the streets of Calcutta, tying rakhis on everyone's hands, irrespective of their religion. Raksha Bandhan was a symbol of union and symbolically countered the government's attempt to divide people. This was followed by a mass meeting where Tagore made an emotional appeal for donation to a national fund, and a very large sum, rupees 50,000, according to the Times, was collected. However, by 1908, Tagore was disillusioned with the political movement. The moderate and extremist groups of the Indian National Congress split after a disgraceful scuffle at the December 1907 session. The violent actions of some young terrorists had led to assassinations, and such violence was unacceptable to Tagore. Tagore's last public speech before his retirement from politics expressed a plea for tolerance and acceptance of the contribution of the West. He pleaded for the ideal of a synthesis of religions, races, and cultures to which the English would also contribute. He explained his retirement by expressing the limitations of patriotism, which alienated him later from many of his countrymen. Quote, I have embraced humanity. I will not buy glass at the price of diamonds. I will not permit patriotism to take precedence over humanity in my life. I took 2 steps down this path and saw that I could go no further. Unquote. We see how this is echoed later in Nikhil's words in Home and the World of Horebairi. Quote, I am willing to serve my country, but my worship I reserve for right, which is far greater than my country. To worship my country as a god is to bring a curse upon it. Unquote. The Tagore stance towards the freedom movement would be different from that of many of his contemporaries, would seem evident from the way he viewed the nation and the ideology of nationalism. His action drew many adverse comments and reactions from people. For instance, we know even Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das at a later stage had called him ironically Sir Rabindranath Tagore, but we know that he actually gave up the title of knighthood, after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So people presume that Tagore was doing it in order to get some profit from the British. And they even misconstrued the national anthem as we find it now, as an eulogy directed to the king. Moreover, critics like Shorkar have found that 1901-1906 are marked by definite ascendancy of traditionalist ideas in Tagore's mind, like a similar early period, 1882 to 1885, which he rejects completely later. However, I do not see in the chronology of Tagore's works a trend which suggests discarding of certain ideas. Tagore did change some of his ideas whenever he felt the need, but some of them, like the distinctive character of Oriental civilization, or that society rather than the Rashtra or state is the real center of Indian civilization, seem to recur in the poet's writings. Nor can they be categorized necessarily as traditionalist. His efforts to show that caste is functional in Indian society because it helped the assimilation of various races into unity appears not only in Bharatbharsha's Itihas, 1902, but as a comparative reference to American racial problems in his essay on nationalism in India, which was written in 1917. Quote, I'm quoting from the nationalism essay, India tolerated difference of races from the first, and that spirit of toleration has acted all through her history. Her caste system is the outcome of this spirit of toleration. For India has all along been trying experiments in evolving a social unity within which all the different peoples could be held together, yet fully enjoying the freedom of maintaining their own differences. This has produced something like a United States of a social federation, whose common name is Hinduism. Unquote. However, as Tagore saw it, in her caste regulations, India recognized differences, but not the mutability which is the law of life. Therefore, life departed from her social system, and in its place she is worshipping with all ceremony the magnificent cage of countless compartments that she has manufactured. Unquote. The last metaphor of cage of countless compartments is telling. As a poet and thinker, Tagore seemed to be most effective in arguing through images. He evidently does not seek to glorify the caste system in its entirety as it existed, or to eulogize it as something great because it is ancient or lauded in the Shastras, but finds in it an effort to resolve the problem of diversity of races through unification. That he criticized the concepts of pollution and untouchability is more than obvious in his eponymous novel Gora, where the Irish-born central character, in his preoccupation with caste-based rules, refuses to let his Brahmin friend Binoy eat in his mother's kitchen because she does not adhere to caste rules, let alone partake of a cooked food himself. Only at the end of the novel, when he gains knowledge of his own roots and acquires true understanding of humanity, does he ask for water from his mother's Christian maid, Lakshmiya. But much more importantly, we see the scathing critique of untouchability and segregation in Tagore's poem, He Mor Durbhaga Desh. In Gitanjali, where Tagore pronounces doom on those who had insulted and suppressed human beings, bringing them down to the lowest level of society. It is only by coming down to their level that the upholders of the caste system can achieve redemption. Shei nimne neme eshu nohile nahire puritran. Unless you come down to the same level, bottom level, there is no saving you. The poem entitled Opoman is much darker in tone and content than Hemod Chitto, where the Brahmin is called to purify his mind and hold everyone's hand in a gesture of equality and unity, so that the Potito or Dalit may efface all his age-old insults and become one with all. Tagore's vision of retributive justice in the poem invites a comparison with a text like J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace, as Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak writes on an article on this. The lines in Spivak's translation, quote, "My unfortunate country, you will have to be equal in disgrace to each and every one of those you have disgraced millennially," unquote. The lowest level in Opoman may be equated with the ground level that Lucy, the raped white woman in disgrace, wants to begin with. She says, quote, to start at ground level with nothing, no cards, no weapons, no property, no rights, no dignity. So, in a sense, these are, Lucy's words spell out for us that bottom level that Tagore describes in his poem. However, that Tagore could condemn untouchability in Hemod Durbhaga Desh around 1912 and then again endorse the functionality of the caste system in his 1917 essay suggests that he does not find discrepancy between these two stances, and nationalism in India does not glorify the caste system as it existed in India at the time. Tagore's attitude towards the East and West is clearly linked with a stance on nationalism, and it is not a traditionalist stance which he discards at any point of time. The book Nationalism, published in 1917, contained 3 essays: Nationalism in the West, Nationalism in Japan, and Nationalism in India, in which he differentiates between the different concepts of nationalism as articulated in the West and the Orient. In Nationalism in the West, he reiterates his view, stated in Bharatbhosho Samaj, a product of his early years, that Indian and Eastern understanding of nationalism was not political but social, and that if a nation's history is shaped by the difficulties it encounters, Indian history was shaped by its internal problems, its process of continual social adjustment, and not that of organized power for defense and aggression. So we do not find him discarding the idea at all. In this, India differed from the Western countries, which encountered difficulties of terrain and hostile neighbors. Tagore talks of the colonial experience and subjection to Britain as an encounter with the machinery of nation. He defines the nation in the sense of the political and economic union of a people, is that aspect which a whole population assumes when organized for a mechanical purpose. Unquote. As distinguished from the nation, a society, quote, is a spontaneous self-expression of man as a social being. It is a natural regulation of human relationships so that men can develop ideals of life in cooperation with one another, unquote. The definitions demonstrate a series of contrasts: mechanical and human, spontaneity and natural as opposed to mechanical, being thereby artificial, political and economic as opposed to social, cooperation as anticipating a contrast with competition. Initially, a society seeks to preserve itself and has a political purpose, but as need for material prosperity grows, power becomes more and more important. When a nation increases its power by scientific achievement and perfecting of organization, it brings in, quote-unquote, harvests of wealth. Nations compete with each other for power and growth of material prosperity. In the contemporary world, Tagore saw the cracking of the living bonds of society, growth of professionalism and power, and the changing psychology of the people moving towards war rather than unity. As a poet and thinker, Tagore develops the contrast between nation and humanity through the extended analogy of the machine. Quote, success is the object and justification of a machine, while goodness is the end and purpose of man. Unquote. He shows the colonial governor as ruling from a disdainful distance, a subject country like India, without coming into human contact, but merely by, quote, manipulation of office and red tape, unquote. The machinery of government image extends into the image of the octopus, wriggling arms in all directions of space and fixing its suckers even into the faraway future, unquote. This is how Tagore characterized the government by the nation which is the organized self-interest of a whole people, where it is the least human and the least spiritual, unquote. Tagore compares prior governments with the British government, conceding that even the former had elements of the machine, but the difference between the former and the latter was the difference between handloom and powerloom. The powerloom is relentlessly lifeless and accurate and monotonous in its productions, unquote. Since the previous reigns by foreign powers were not governments by the nation, they were less restrictive, less powerful in surveillance. Quote, their texture was loosely woven, leaving big gaps, unquote, which enabled the subjects to design and shape their own lives. Tagore's personal experience with the English people was positive. He saw them as great-hearted men who loved justice and freedom, but his conflict was with the British nation and government, which surpassed and overwhelmed the individual. Conflict, competition, and conquest were at the core of Western nationalism. He images the imperialist Western nations as predatory creatures who are fighting among themselves for greater colonial exploitation. He describes the process of colonial exploitation and antagonism between colonial powers as, in fact, these nations are fighting among themselves for the extension of their victims and their reserve forests, Unquote. The Asian nations, or the multitude of no nations as he calls them, are the victims of the imperial Western powers. He distinguishes between Western civilization and Western nationalism, which does not allow the fruits of Western civilization to reach the subject nations. He criticizes the ideology of nationalism, which propagates itself by attendant instruments of self-glorification. Quote, the nation with all its paraphernalia of power and prosperity, its flags and pious hymns, its blasphemous prayers in the churches, the literary mock thunders of patriotic bragging, unquote. Even religion was put to the use and advancement of national self-interest. The spirit of competition that is inherent in nationalism inspires only dread of evil on the birth of a fellow nation. After Japan developed its nationhood, the Western countries grew bitter at Japan's claim of a superior civilization, a claim they themselves had voiced over the years unabashedly. Because the idealism of selfishness must keep itself drunk with a continual dose of self-laudation. Unquote. Characterized by competition, self-interest, self-glorification, materialism, and imperialism in the West, the nation-state, as it had evolved then in the West, was opposed to the spirit of harmony and union, which were the guiding principles of Tagore's philosophy. It was no wonder that he was opposed to it. His appeal to Japan during his visits was not to ape the West, but to cultivate the spirit of Eastern philosophy of unity and fraternity. Tagore's concept of the Eastern and Western civilizations as complementing each other, the East symbolizing spiritual profundity, while the West bringing in the gift of science and active intellectual thought, was pervasive in Tagore. As Stephen Hay says, this did not originate with Rabindranath. It was the natural expression, quote, in an idealized form of the symbiosis between upper caste Hindus and the British rulers in 19th century Bengal, unquote. People like Ram Mohan Ray and Keshav Chandra Sen had voiced these ideas. In a lecture on Asia's message to Europe, delivered in Calcutta in 1883, Keshav Chandra Sen linked the four themes of India as the essence of Asia, of Asia as spiritually incarnate, of himself as Asia's representative, and of the complementarity of Asian and European civilization. In the last quarter of the 19th century, India's spiritual greatness had gained hold upon Western and Indian intellectuals alike. The Russian Madame Blavatsky and the American Colonel Olcott, who founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, were inspired by the ideals of reincarnation in Hindu and Buddhist ideas. Similarly, F. Max Muller, the Oxford professor of Sanskrit, also very influentially spread the idea of the philosophical heritage and spiritual supremacy of India to the West. India's most successful missionary to the West was, of course, Swami Vivekananda, whose visit to the Chicago World Parliament of Religions in 1893, an exposition of Hinduism to an admiring American audience, won him fame and interest grew in Asian religions. Vivekananda equated India's spirituality with the essence of Eastern or Asian civilization. Quote, the voice of Asia has been the voice of religion, the voice of Europe, the voice of politics. Each is great in its own sphere, unquote. It was a speech before the Los Angeles audience in 1900. Similarities with Tagore are obviously evident. This concept of a synthesis between Indo-Asian spirituality and Western practicality was the message that Tagore delivered before to his audience in Japan and China, and also the United States and Europe in his various visits to these countries. In an essay, The Letters from Joined Chinamen, which turned out to be actually written by G. Lewis Dickinson, a fellow at King's College, Cambridge, condemned the cruelty of the foreign imperial powers while suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, and expressed the fundamental antagonism between Eastern and Western civilization. The ideas enthused Tagore greatly. Tagore had also become close to the Japanese artist-philosopher Okakura Kakuzo, taught by Ernest Fenollosa, who propounded the idea of the synthesis between the two opposing civilizations of the East and the West on Okakura's visit to India in 1901. Tagore disapproved of Japanese attacks on China as imperialist overtures and repeatedly advised the Japanese to forsake such moves and exemplify the Eastern stance. It is important to realize that Tagore's vision of the essentialist helped him to pose an alternative to Western nationalism and colonialism. I'd like to come back to a point which I had made earlier about Tagore's respect for his revolutionaries. If we look at, despite his retirement and aversion to violence and hatred with which he associated the freedom movement, he seemed to have admired the patriotism of some of the young men whose courage, selflessness, and integrity he had witnessed. Probably in keeping with his admiration for individuals and their qualities, irrespective of isms, he never ceased to admire them. So there is no he does not really stop from describing their character, describing their action as illuminating and as sacrificial and completely selfless. Writing in Kalantar much later in 1939, he wrote, "I have seen the burning desire in the hearts of the youths of Bengal. They were born to light a lamp in the country, but making a serious mistake, they struck a fire, burning themselves and changed the right path into the wrong. Yet through the terrible failure of their great mistake, they reveal the greatness of their brave hearts, such as I have never seen anywhere else in India at the time. Their repeated sacrifices and sufferings, act of laying down their lives, have been swiftly reduced to utter futility, but they have at least fearlessly proved Bengal's indomitable will." Sujit Kumar Mukhopadhyay has written how one evening in Shantiniketan, Tagore, talking to Acharya Kiti Mohan Sen and others about the capacity for self-sacrifice of these revolutionary youths, compared them with the non-violent Swadeshi workers. Quote, "One cannot compare them, the revolutionaries, with the others. Such power of endurance, such astonishing mental strength. One who has not seen them will not be able to understand." Unquote. Elsewhere, he had mockingly drawn a distinction between them and the so-called Congressite Swadeshis by saying, quote, "At the end of the road, not only is there no government job or state honor awaiting them, the revolutionaries, but their path is also replete with conflicts with their prudent guardians at home. They have not tried to make the path easy for treading by using the application papers of the Congress." Unquote. Tagore's distinction between the two groups is brought out by the different designs of the plot and the character portrayals in his two novels, Home and the World, and 1915, and Charudhai, 1934. So I would like to show here that if we consider the trajectory of his fictional writing, we see a difference between the way his ideas develop in his works on nationalism and other, to some extent, at least, and other non-fictional works. While Tagore builds both narratives around love, he makes the earlier work, in The Home and the World, a tale of seduction of a woman by a false nationalist, and the later, a story of the tragedy of young love in conflict with misguided patriotism. Tagore makes Nikhil's wife Bimola the site of the contest between two kinds of love and two rival ideologies. Nikhil, the husband of Bimola, exemplifies true love, which images constructive patriotism, and Sandeep, his friend, whose false charm and possessive love hold out the lure of flamboyant and deceptive nationalism and adultery. By contrast, in Charudhai, it is the brilliant young man Utindra who has been attracted by the love of Ella into the trap of the revolutionaries. It is a story of Utin's degeneration against his will and of his love because of the constraints of his commitment. But Tagore refrains from creating even Indranath, the unemotional, iron-willed revolutionary leader in Charudhai, a fraud like Sandeep. Actually, Tagore bases Utin's critique or Utin's character on one of his friends, Brahmabandhu Upadhyay, who had at one time come to Tagore and said, "Rabi Babu, amar khub potun hoyeche," that means I have suffered degradation because of the cause with which he was associated. Moreover, although both Bimola and Ella are responsible for the tragedy, the later work does not present the sense of the woman's moral compromise as in Korebaire or Home and the World. And by portraying the emotional depth of a single-minded desire, the author lets Ella score over Bimola. Tagore was, at the time of writing the Korebaire, Tagore was especially unhappy with the practice of the boycott of British textiles, which only helped, in his view, to multiply the profits of the Bombay mill owners. Besides, he was hurt and unhappy at the injustice committed on the poor traders, the majority of whom were Muslims, at least in East Bengal, who were forced to burn the goods that they had bought for their livelihood. He felt rightly that the poor had no understanding of the movement, which was on the whole confined to the educated middle classes for their own interest. He also feared that it would lead to division between the Hindus and Muslims. As a matter of fact, there had been riots in various parts of East Bengal some years before the novel was written. For instance, in Kumilla in 1907 March, and at Jamalpur and Diwanganj, Bakshiganj region of Mymensingh in April-May 1907. British officers and communal Muslim leaders blamed the cause of the riots on the unpopular efforts of Swadeshi zamindars, mostly Hindus, to force Muslim peasants to buy indigenous costly articles of clothing. The riots lend credence to the frequency of the compulsive activities and unscrupulous zamindars, like Harish Kundu, who occurs in Korebaire, whose coercive measures led to the final riot between Hindus and Muslims in Korebaire and the looting of his treasury. Tagore's reactions to destructive activities were of a piece with his views of constructive Swadeshi, like village upliftment and the development of self and the nation through indigenous educational system. In Shutti Raubhan, or The Call of the Truth, Tagore declares, "We have been ordered to burn foreign cloth. I, for one, am unable to obey. First, because I believe it to be my duty to fight the habit of blind obedience. Secondly, I feel that the cloth to be burnt is not mine. It belongs to people who are sorely in need of it. We who seem to be doing an act of sacrifice through the incendiarism have other sources of supply, but those who are really hit cannot stir out of doors because of their nakedness." He thought that there was no need to make spectacular bonfires of British-made goods, which seemed to him a waste. He argued that such destructive orgies arose out of a spirit of hatred, which was not conducive to constructive service of the country. Tagore had a clear aversion to coercion and any mode of persuasion which veiled a threat, but had faith only in spontaneous change of heart that came from a true love of the country and a constructive desire for the common weal. William Rothenstein found in Home and the World a masterpiece of simple and uncompromising statement. To make this statement against Swadeshi excesses, Tagore often makes Nikhil speak the language of his author, while Sandeep voices the sentiments of the leaders of the early phase of the non-cooperation movement. Although the novel's narrative structure apparently shirks authorial dominance and is built around multiple voices and perspectives, Shundeep's proclaimed brand of nationalism and his self-disclosure so obviously contradict accepted norms of morality that the reader is almost inevitably alienated from the flamboyant leader. He claims, "My powers are limited, so my worship of humanity is limited to my country." When Nikhil argues against hating other countries, Shundeep replies that hate is also an adjunct of worship. He preaches that doing injustice for one's country is not wrong. Let us first fill our country's coffers with stolen goods and then take centuries like these other countries to answer for them if we must. Significantly, it is a penchant for Sandeep's brand of patriotism that shows the lack of Bimola's discrimination between the false show of patriotism and its true form. She was lured by Sandeep precisely because her nature had an innate bias towards ostentation, undirected enthusiasm, and intoxication. Nikhil characterizes her as one who loves to find the boisterous in men, the turbulent, the angry, the unjust. Her respect must have its element of fear. From the tip of her tongue to the pit of her stomach, she must tingle with red pepper in order to enjoy the simple fare of life. As we have seen, Tagore often argues through images, the imagery of fire reminiscent of the incendiarism that Tagore criticizes as negative motivation and mindless enthusiasm runs through the novel. Shundip is constantly associated with fire. He shook like a quivering tongue of fire. His eyes showered scorching sparks on me. The fire in his words had flamed up more fiercely. His language is fiery and it provokes the fire of enthusiasm. He is the true servant of the country, quote unquote, because he is, quote, this flaming intelligence, this burning energy, this shining genius, unquote. The motive for fire as a destructive and negative force is reiterated throughout the novel, linking feelings of artificial or whipped-up enthusiasm and unrestrained sexual desire with the bonfires of British-made clothes that the Swadeshi volunteers lit as a symbol of their Deshbhakti. Through Bimola's attraction for Shundip, Tagore demonstrates not only the sexual fascination of a woman for the sensual, showy and corrupt, but also the country's attraction for a political ideology, which has the potential to mislead thousands. The sexual seduction serves as a trope for the political corruption. By contrast, in Charodhai, in 1934, it is chiefly Otin who voices Tagore's critique of the movement. Significantly, it is through Otin's narration and such fitful glimpses that we get of his consciousness that we are acquainted with the sufferings and the sacrifice of finer feelings of his fellow patriots and himself. Quote, then I came to know the boys one after another, boys, the dust of whose feet I had taken, had they not been so much younger than I. What have they not seen since? What have they not suffered? What insults they have not borne? The whole story will never see the light of day. Unquote. And Charodhai does not let it see the light of day. One wonders why we see so few concrete instances of this degradation that is harped on repeatedly in the novel, and this is poses a contrast with the earlier novel Koravadi. Except for one reference to a robbery where a poor widow who had befriended one of the youths was murdered because she recognized the disguised youth, Otin refrains from describing the excesses which he never tires of repeating. The implicit admiration in the portrayal of the young lovers and the tragedy of their love in Charodhai, on the other hand, Charodhai suggests a sympathy of their creator which goes beyond condemnation and invests their cause with ambivalence. Significantly, the last short story that Tagore wrote on the cause of the revolutionaries, and this was in 1941, which seems to make amends for the critique he had indulged in Charodhai. It avoids a love plot. Bodhnam, written in 1649, shows us an extremely capable revolutionary leader outwitting the police force again and again. The stupidity and manifest incompetence of the police force enforces the comic nature of their futile quest. By eliminating violence, which is a concomitant of a secret armed insurrection, Tagore lends credence to the cause and avoids the tragic resolution that almost inevitably emerges in the earlier novels. The final defeat of the police inspector only pinpoints the matchless integrity and incomparable superiority of the revolutionary and the inspector's wife, who, unknown to him, has been participating in the movement. She has, however, been impeccably true to her marriage vow. Her dedication to the cause, like Ella's in Charodhai, is an ideological pursuit. Despite disassociating from the movement, if we consider the trajectory of his fictional writings, therefore, we see Tagore seems to be following an alternative path, because in this last short story, he seems to endorse the freedom movement and the revolutionary activity of the hero. I go on to Tagore and Gandhiji. Of course, lots can be written on it, lots have been written on it, but I'm just touching on this point, because without it, the paper cannot be complete. Tagore had written about Gandhiji in Kalantar. We know about the mutual respect of the two great figures. In 1939, in Kalantar, Tagore has written, "The great character of the Mahatma is a subject of astonishment for me. The destiny of India had sent us through his hands an enlightening, unsurpassable, fateful power. The strength and power should teach Indians to think for themselves, decide for themselves, and to commit sacrifice when necessary." Unquote, of course, is my translation. Despite immense mutual respect for each other, Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi had differences as well as similarities in thinkings. The similarity of views, as we see, I'm just referring to them. Inner Swaraj is a precondition for external Swaraj, inherent value of suffering and work, village, self-government, etc. Differences are the use of the strategy of non-cooperation, which is called for blind obedience. He has an essay on the Chorka in Kalantar. Here, okay, I'm just finishing. Tagore disagreed with Gandhiji's call for spinning. According to Leonard Gordon, Tagore rejected the strategy of non-cooperation because of its blind obedience and narrowness in stressing the single ideal of spinning. He also thought of the progress of science and the primitiveness of Chorka. To use the Chorka eternally would be equivalent to stagnating. From Chorka, he writes at the beginning of the essay, at the beginning of history, when the spindle was used to produce wealth, wealth continued to increase and the process did not stop with the spindle. If we accept the advice that the primitive Chorka is the best for spinning thread, then we will never get the goodwill of Vishnu and Lakshmi will turn away her face. He questioned that 33 crores of Indians, irrespective of their individual differences, should have to dedicate their time and energy to this rotating spindle. Does Chorka really have that greatness? Moreover, Tagore wanted to retain the gains of Western education, science and technology and lay the ground for meeting of all cultures on a basis of mutual extent. He feared that Gandhism, particularly in practice, would end in India turning in upon herself and bring about her destruction rather than gaining her long-sought freedom. In keeping with his rejection of destructive acts, Tagore also disapproved of the burning of British cloth. Tagore's relevance today. Tagore's views of India as the meeting ground of cultures. In his poem Hemochito, India is imaged as a sea of humanity where people of diverse races, religions, castes and cultures mingle without restraint. It produces a cosmopolitan vision and a cosmopolitan identity. Tagore's view of the complementarity of the East and the West is accepted almost universally in contemporary India. Tagore incorporated his cosmopolitan vision in the World University that he created. His vision of Shantiniketan in December 1918 was the creation of an institution, quote, which would be the true center for all the existing cultures of the world, and where the wealth of past learning might be brought into living contact with modern influences. The motto taken from a Vedic text was, where the whole world forms its one single nest. Western nationalism in its narrowest and most disastrous form had been seen in Nazi Germany. Tagore's prophecy of Western nationalism was right to an extent. In today's Europe, we see acceptance of diversity. Our principle in India is unity in diversity. Tagore had differences with nationalists who defended Hindu cultural integrity against the arrogant claims of Western superiority. But Tagore feared isolationism, and isolation in any form was his greatest aversion. Finally, his regard for all religions in the world produced and led to a secular approach which has become the accepted principle of post-independence India. I stop here.
Thank you, Rita. It was a very comprehensive paper. I'm so glad that you have used both of, Tagore's creative writing as well as his different lectures and essays. So, actually, there are few things I will tell you later, but first I will invite questions, suggestions, observations, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. What you point out is that there is an inherent contradiction in Tagore in the sense that he disavows and he, in a certain sense, rejects militant nationalism, yet he cannot get over his respect and admiration for the youth who, give their lives, sacrifice, the value of sacrifice, for instance. You've referred in great extent to Ghode Baide. And while the distinction between the false nationalist and the true humanist and nationalist, Shondip and Nikhil, is very clear, what this talk really brought back to me is the figure of that 16-year-old boy who gives up school and becomes Shondip's follower, and eventually disillusioned comes back with that box of jewelry to return to Bimola, because he believes that the cause that he dedicated his life to was right, but the way in which the trajectory of the movement has happened, that's completely wrong. So I think that the respect that Tagore had for revolutionaries who were willing to sacrifice all is in a certain sense manifested as early as 1915 in that young boy's character, which of course comes back again and again, as you point out very rightly, in Charodhai and Badnam. This is basically a comment, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Yes, Omullo does, there are characters like Omullo in Ghore Baire who would suggest that there's a positive approach of Tagore towards Omullo. And even in this the initial Swadeshi movement, there were characters like Omullo, and people who were deluded partially by leaders who were more selfish or fraudulent. So he does make that distinction. It is true that Omullo in many ways comes close to some of the figures that Otindra talks about in Charodhai. That is true. So there were certainly figures like that. He's showing that, but he's also trying to show by making Sandip the leader of the movement and making him a fraudulent figure, he tries to shift some blame on him and to sort of slur this comes to the slur on the movement to an extent. But thank you for the question.
No, I have a very small point to make.
Sure.
From my reading, I'm not a scholar on Tagore. Taking from the cue of your title, Tagore and the Nation, what I feel from reading of Tagore's novels and short stories and essays, that Tagore's notion of nation has two qualifiers. One is the community, and the other is the internationalism. It is not a watertight compartment. Like if you go through the short stories and some of the poems also, Tagore's notion of the community and his idea about how the process of emergence of a nation through colonialism is breaking down the notion of community. Of community, yes. Pre-colonial community. Because nation is now emerging and the community is breaking down. This is one point I felt. I'm not a scholar, I tell you. This is my personal impression. And secondly, everyone knows Tagore's internationalism. He always, you also mentioned that he always believed that nationalism does not mean that you should restrict your vision. It has to go beyond. And you did, I'm really surprised, why didn't you mention Gora? Because Tagore qualified, not that much.
She did mention.
Yes, but not...
very little. You're
yes.
right.
Because Ghore Baire is a crude, expression of his, what I should say, the friction in the nationalist sentiment. But Gora is very philosophical, very sophisticated, and very suave, and very idealistic. At the same time, very practical. Sorry, this is my...
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Vanda. This was a very good question. These two questions. About community and... yes, I do think that for Tagore, community was very important. And that's what he means, I think, by the social, the society. So the community cannot really... in his Nationalism in India, he's talking about how society or social communities are breaking down partly because of the onslaught of nation as a force or a mechanical kind of force. So he thinks that national power is something very strong, and it can actually break down the goodwill and the cooperation, the brotherhood of people that existed in communities to some extent. And I think, yes, I would equate that with the society that he is talking about, that we find in Indian society, in India, as opposed to the Western nations. So I believe you're right about that. Oh, internationalism, of course, we've talked about. As for Goda, yes, I think I should have. It is a very good novel, but there was so much material. Yes.
Just I'm asking, what is the word for which we are using the word community? What is the original Bengali word? Community. Community itself is a Western concept, more or less.
I think the closest we can get to is Shamaj or society, but I'll have to think of that more. Yeah, Gosht.
But Tagore has always used, as far as I recall, it is Samaj. And about this Bakurar Janakosto, that is Bengali essay.
Yeah.
So, he has squarely, made this colonial government responsible.
Community
He
versus...
no uncertain type. He has,
community versus nation concept made
He
in
feels that the community should exert itself and they build up all the relief efforts and they should be doing all the work.
And that's how our society has sustained.
Yes. This is characteristic of Indian society.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ma'am, my question is, we in Rabindra Sangit, we see the Puja Porjay and the Prakriti Porjay, where we see his respect to nature. Do you think that his respect to nature is shown in other spheres of his life, like in Shantiniketan or the surrounding areas like Bolpur, and some rural development regarding some environmental activities?
Certainly, I don't know much about this, but yes, I think the school in this natural surroundings and the way the people get to know nature, Shantiniketan is very much part of, one would make a cause for environmentalism today, I think, if necessary. He's very close to nature. And I think that's what Tagore's village development, Sriniketan also had to do with nature, natural activities, as opposed to these more mechanical things,
Ma'am, do you regard him as an environmentalist?
Pardon? Regard Tagore as an environmentalist?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I should think so. I think people know more about that. Yes.
He started this Bono Mahotsav. Then, just last week, you have seen this Basanta Utsav. The 4 principles on which Shantiniketan was built is nature, then internationalism, creativity, and something else. I'm just not getting it.
Basu, thank you so much. You know more about this.
Community, of course, community.
Thank you.
Thank you for your paper, ma'am. So what I gathered is that there are 2 central tropes that emerge in Tagore's writing. One is the foregrounding of the society, and the other is that of the human subject. So I was wondering if you could...
can you say it again?
There are 2 kinds of figurations that emerge in Tagore's writing. One is, as you said, the idea of society is privileged over the nation. And second is a certain kind of a foregrounding of the human subject. So I was wondering that what is this vision of the human subject that emerges in his writings? So is it a plea for a human subject who is uncontaminated, say uncontaminated from power, treachery, jealousy, these kinds of things. So what is this imagery of the human subject that we find in his oeuvre, in his writings?
Okay, thank you.
Talking about a certain kind of humanism or a grounding of the human subject. So who is this human figure that he imagines through his writings that weaves in his oeuvre?
So something which is opposed to society, I would say to the nation. The individual is opposed to the nation. Do you mean it in the sense of subject countries, or do you mean the human subject? Okay.
If I can just intervene. I think...
I have something to say about, sorry, as my introduction, we are not student or scholar.
No.
We are bhakt. Wherever there is Rabindranath, yes. We are coming from Calcutta.
We will just come to that. I will just come to that. You said that, I think Tagore has again and again reiterated that creativity should be in the center of, human development. And he has, in his nationalism lectures, again and again, he puts its power to everywhere, and that's how, human creativity is curtailed. It is compromised. And four things I forgot now. Joy is one of the element. Joy is one of the element on which Shantiniketan is built. And internationalism, in many Rabindra Sangeet, so many, Western tunes were, used. And about that bhakto, I will say, yes, Bengali in general are Rabindra bhakto. But no. But let me finish, please. During his lifetime, Tagore was the person who was attacked most on every count. Whatever he did, there are lots of oppositions. Sorry if I misunderstood you.
100% right about the nationalism and all.
Please ask if you have a question. Please come here. No. We are recording it.
Okay.
There is a reason I am asking you to use the microphone.
You see,
Yes.
first Shantiniketan started as an ashram, just as a school, very small school, because Rabindranath found that his father, the place here, it was a very shanto. Porivesh was beautiful. So the Shantiniketan name was given. It is my perception of reading various places. Now what happened? As far as the nationalism is concerned, it is not. The perception of Shantiniketan came much after. It became university only after the Nobel Prize, if you go that way. You see, the money which was infused. But he participated with Aurobindo and Subodh together to create the National University, which later became Jadavpur University. If you remember, he was one of the founder of that university. National Council of Education. And Aurobindo was made principal of that place. Of course, later Aurobindo left. He left for the different TA. And Bhakto, well, both of us are from different professions. She was, of course, student of literature and as well advocate. I was engineer. But today, somehow I don't know. I found that reading a lot, that it's an ocean. His philosophy and everything is so great. It's like an ocean. And we feel that we are trying to sail on an uncharted boat in that ocean. I don't know, we will never come out. We are going down and down. We may not be able to surface up in our lifetime. This is beyond any today's philosophy. I'm telling you the philosophy. He was a scientist. You remember his letters with Einstein. That's all. This is what I am to say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Another gentleman. Please use the mic.
Please use the mic.
Please.
My name is Rajiv Saxena. and now I'm writing on strategic affairs and global politics. I strongly believe that most of the Bengalis, whom I interacted with, they are really hawks of Rabindranath Tagore. You go to their houses, you will find a picture of Rabindranath Tagore ji along with Vivekananda ji and Ramkrishna. I forgot the name. The three leading things. And in few of them who have the revolutionary trains, you will find the of Aurobindo. Number two, the aspects is one of the very first short stories which I read in my school was in Kabuliwala. And that was one of the very nice first stories to have a good relations between India and Afghanistan, because our Afghanistan was something like extended India, and the people were very friendly, and you have a lot of colonies and colonies of people over there in Calcutta, in New Delhi, in some other parts of the world. And my niece is doing a PhD on Afghan diaspora in our nation over there.
Sir, your question?
My third question is, you talked about caste and creed in the mindset of Rabindranath Tagore. Like, can you answer that? What were his biases and what were his treats or the affections for which caste are there? Because I found.
Say it again, please. I didn't get it. Could you say it again? I couldn't.
You talked about
caste, yeah.
Caste system over there, and people say that he was very. There's a feeling that he was a high caste Hindu.
He was not a Hindu. He was a Brahmo.
Okay, Brahma. Brahman means Hindu means a Brahman over there.
They are very antagonistic.
Anyway, let her answer.
Let her answer. Now, how did he treat it? The other.
All right. Let her answer.
Yes, Brahma wala, yes.
No, I didn't get the question.
His question is, did Rabindranath Tagore show any inclination towards caste system? Did he favor any particular castes, etc.?
No, obviously, in how he talked about critiqued untouchability in him or Durvagadesh and others, he didn't believe in caste system that way, but at the beginning, in some of his essays, he's talked about the caste system as an age-old system which had tried to cope with the difficulty of the incursion of various races into India. And it seemed to him a good system that way. But most of the excesses, the contemporary practices, he did not approve of. Yeah, Chandalika, yes.
Ma'am, when you were talking about this East-West duality in the views of Rabindranath Tagore and how he viewed East as being more spiritual and West being scientifically more advanced and how both of them complement each other, don't you think by in his views he was falling in the same trap which years later came to be viewed as Orientalism?
To some extent, yes, when we are talking about spiritualism and materialism, that kind of thing, yes, and this has been noticed by even he and others, because he seemed to have, when Vivekananda is talking about politics for Westerners and spirituality and religion for Indians or Asians as such, one might say that there is this dichotomy that is emerging, and in some ways, yes, I would say that Orientalist configurations are there, but one can look at it from various perspectives. One doesn't have to say that. It is there, but but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily negative. Or I think when he talks about other things as well. He does talk about spirituality or religion as characterizing the Eastern subject, but he brings in various other things, especially in his fictional writings. So I wouldn't say that it is like, he really is sort of imprisoned within that dichotomy.
Anyway, if I may add to what you said in response to this question, and that would also constitute my own comment on your fascinating and indeed brilliant lecture on the subject. As a student of history, I believe that all our great thinkers and leaders of the 19th and 20th century, to varying extents facing the colonial context, were influenced by colonial ideas and discourses. Nobody is completely outside of it, so it is not surprising that the colonial discourse, the Orientalist discourse which started in the late 18th century, affected even great thinkers, very great thinkers like Rabindranath Tagore. It is not entirely surprising. And in fact, this dichotomy that we do find in both Vivekananda, Rabindranath, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and everybody else, and especially I notice it, within the Bengali thinkers, I can say that, So I notice it across the spectrum of all these brilliant, thinkers who emerged from Bengal, who somehow or the other argue subconsciously in response to the colonial discourse that India somehow is a spiritual civilization. India is a spiritual civilization, and that is the greatness that India has. On the other hand, the West, of course, is a deeply materialistic civilization, and materialism is here sought to be demonized in some sense and denounced and denigrated. Maybe not directly, but indirectly. That's what it is. I think that this continues, not simply, in the pre-independence days. This continues right up to the present. You find that a lot of important thinkers in India still argue, on those lines and think that somehow India was a uniquely spiritual civilization. Many people, for example, argue about this Eastern civilization concept. Eastern civilizations and the unity among Eastern civilizations. But I ask them, what is the unity between India and China, for example? What is the similarity? We have more similarity with the West. Look at the languages, for example. Even without learning French or Italian or Spanish, you can make some sense out of them. But can you make any sense out of Chinese language, for example? You can't make any sense.
But apart from language, there are some similarities.
What are the similarities? I would like to ask, I would certainly like to ask, what are the similarities? So that is where I see, Rabindranath Tagore's internationalism as, rather sort of oblivious of the fundamental differences between the Eastern civilizations.
Tagore never really discarded science or discarded the West. He's talking about complementarity.
Yeah, I'm not saying he discarded the West. On the other hand, what I'm saying is that when he talks about internationalism, when he talks about internationalism, what he overlooks is that the West became powerful and great because of nationalism. If it did not have nationalism, it would not have been able to conquer the world and colonize the world. So it becomes a historical anachronism in a way. If you think that India will become independent, or if you think that Indian civilization can be regenerated without nationalism, that's where his difference with Gandhi lies. By the way, when Gandhi started these bonfires during the non-cooperation movement, that is when the great debate between Gandhi and Tagore took place. And Tagore said, you are wasting good cloth, it can be used by the poor people. Gandhi responded saying that, look, that is the whole point of it. The poor are equal members of our nation. If we give the cloth, which cannot be worn by the well-off, to the poor, that means you are denigrating them. So these were two different views. Anyway, this is an endless debate, but I just wanted your response.
I would say that he's not thinking of greatness in that sense only. To that extent, he has some similarities to Gandhi. Greatness as, material greatness. He thinks that it is necessary to have the gifts of science, but at the same time, not to have that kind of self-interest, which would let the Western powers colonize others and exploit them. He doesn't think that is greatness. That's the way I think he looks at it.
And another thing, burning of clothes, it happened during Swadeshi movement. Before Gandhi. And another thing,
but at that time Tagore probably did not take that view, no?
No, he was against it. Yeah. He didn't support this. You referred that this something you said, Keshav Chandra Sen in 1883, but I will also add to it that Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Anand Math, when he was, he revised the ending, he said that, so Mahapurush comes and 10th Satarundu, you withdraw from the agitation. We have to learn, we are powerful in spiritual power, but the material things we have to learn from West. So, you retreat now.
Actually, he wrote, it is a given thing. And he discussed about this crisis of civilizational encounter in various places, but one particular place called Shokuna Shankar, the crisis of civilization.
Last piece of his writing.
In detail.
Anyway, we think we have good debate about everything. Thank you very much, madam. Your paper was very good, very comprehensive.
Thank you very much, you know.
And
I would like to thank everybody for coming
and the audience also.
Asking
They
questions.
very patiently listened to it.
Yes,
and
exactly.
then, made observation, debate, everything. One thing I forgot to ask, Ghore Baire you referred as 1915, but probably it is 1916. This English and Bengali year, there is some problem, but everywhere
Maybe
it is
home and the
referred
world,
in 1916.
All right, so we had a fascinating discussion on this very important subject. I once again thank Dr. Rita Banerjee and also Professor Nandita Basu for her presence, and I thank, there are various fellows of NMML who are present here. I thank them all, and I thank all other participants also for this lively discussion. Thank you very much, and tea is waiting outside.